I am Desmond, 72 years old, and I am still recovering from the betrayal orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. As a retired systems engineer, I was used to fixing broken things, but I never realized my own family was beyond repair. Last Tuesday, the mail carrier handed me a battered package. Before I could even look at the return address, my daughter snatched it right out of my hands. What I managed to hide in my sleeve that day contained a message from my late wife, dead for 4 years. The note simply said, "Go to our old cafe. Do not tell Adrian." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a family who underestimated your worth. Now, let me tell you what the cafe owner handed me, and how it completely destroyed my daughter's perfect lie. The front door had barely clicked shut when Adrian ripped the cardboard box out of my grip. She demanded to know what it was, shaking the dented package in my face. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the blank return address. I kept my expression entirely blank, a survival skill I had been forced to perfect over the last 4 years. Since my wife Marlene passed away from a sudden medical emergency, I had surrendered my independence. I moved into Adrian and her husband Trevor's sprawling suburban house under the illusion that they wanted to care for me in my grief. The reality was vastly different. I quickly became their unpaid live-in housekeeper, a silent ghost expected to fix the plumbing, maintain the yard, and never ask questions about their extravagant lifestyle. While Adrienne aggressively tore at the packing tape, loudly complaining about unsolicited junk mail, my fingers were already working. I had spent 30 years engineering complex systems, making my hands accustomed to fast, precise movements. In one fluid motion, I slipped the thin sealed envelope that had been resting on top of the bubble wrap right up my cardigan sleeve. Adrienne dumped the packing peanuts onto the hardwood floor, scoffing when she found only a cheap promotional mug inside. She tossed the box into the recycling bin, warning me not to sign for anonymous garbage again, and marched back to her home office. She had absolutely no idea she had missed the real delivery. I locked the bathroom door, turning the sink faucet on full blast to mask any noise. My hands trembled as I slid the envelope from my sleeve. The handwriting on the front made my lungs seize. It was Marlene. Crisp, meticulously angled cursive. The exact same handwriting I had seen on decades of tax returns and anniversary cards. I ripped the seal open. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock with a terrifyingly brief message. "Go to our old cafe. Do not tell Adrian." Marlene was a fierce pragmatist. As a former senior chief accountant, she planned for every variable and never left riddles. If she scheduled a letter to arrive exactly 4 years after her death, deliberately excluding our only daughter, something was catastrophically wrong. Just as I folded the note into my pocket, angry voices erupted from the hallway outside the bathroom. It was Trevor, my son-in-law, his voice dripping with venom. He told Adrian that the bridge loan was due on Thursday, and if they did not come up with the liquidity, the bank would take the house. Adrian hissed back, telling him to lower his voice before the old man hears. She whispered harshly that they just needed a little more time to get the medical power of attorney sorted out. I held my breath against the cold bathroom tiles. They were drowning in massive debt, and they were actively plotting to seize my remaining assets to save themselves. I had to get out of that house immediately. Adrienne had recently taken to locking the deadbolt and hiding the key whenever she worked from home, claiming she was terrified I would wander off and get lost. It was a calculated narrative she was building, painting me to the neighbors as a confused, declining old man. But I knew the structural flaws of that house better than they did. I slipped into the laundry room, unlatched the frosted window, and squeezed myself through the narrow frame, dropping quietly into the side alley. I walked 2 miles to the worn-down diner where Marlene and I used to spend our Sunday mornings. The bell above the door chimed. The owner, an older man named Otis, stopped wiping the counter the second he saw me. He did not ask how I had been. 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 Safe deposit key. He slid it across the counter, his face deadly serious. Marlene gave me this, a month before she passed, he said in a low voice. She made me swear on my life to hand it to you exactly 4 years to the day. And Desmond, you need to be extremely careful. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I picked up the cold metal key. I asked him why. Otis leaned in closer, his eyes darting toward the diner window. Because your daughter came in here looking for it 2 years ago, he whispered. She tore this place apart, demanding to know what Marlene left behind. She knows about the box, Desmond, and she is hunting for it. I stepped out of the diner, and the midday sun felt blinding. The metal key sitting in my right pocket felt heavier than lead. I did not waste time walking back to the neighborhood where my daughter was frantically trying to salvage her sinking financial ship. Instead, I caught a city bus heading straight for the downtown financial district. The key bore the faded logo of Halbrook Trust Bank, the oldest branch in the city. Marlene had maintained a private account there since the 80s. I walked through the heavy revolving doors, my boots sinking into the plush carpet, and headed directly for the subterranean vault desk. I handed the brass key to the young vault manager, sitting behind the reinforced glass. She took it with a polite smile and typed my credentials into her computer. A loud, sharp error tone echoed from her terminal. Her smile vanished instantly. She frowned at her screen, her fingers clicking frantically across the keyboard, before she looked up at me with profound discomfort. She slid the key back across the counter. I am incredibly sorry, sir, she said, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. Your safe deposit box has been flagged with a medical security hold. My chest tightened. I asked her exactly what a medical security hold meant. She nervously adjusted her glasses, reading directly from the monitor. She told me that my daughter Adrienne had submitted a preliminary medical affidavit 3 weeks ago. The document claimed I was showing severe signs of advanced cognitive decline and dangerous wandering. Because of this flag, the bank required Adrienne's physical presence and dual signature to grant me access to the vault. I stood completely frozen. Adrienne had not just been treating me like a maid, she had been actively establishing a legal paper trail to declare me mentally incompetent. She was preparing to strip away my fundamental human rights. The sheer calculation of her betrayal threatened to knock the wind out of me. She had laid this trap nearly a month ago, smiling at me across the dinner table while secretly legally suffocating me. But Adrienne was arrogant, and she vastly underestimated the woman who raised her. Marlene had never trusted any system completely. I placed my hands flat on the cold marble counter, leaning in close so the manager had to look me in the eye. I told her to check the secondary executive bypass protocol on the account. The manager looked confused but typed the command. Her eyebrows shot up. She confirmed there was a master override code, but warned me that if I failed the security prompt, she would be legally obligated to freeze the account entirely and notify my daughter immediately. I did not hesitate. I gave her the 6-digit numerical code, 041276. I watched the screen turn from flashing red to solid green. The lock mechanism under the desk clicked open. That 6-digit sequence was April 12, 1976. It was the birth date of our very first child, a little boy who was born premature and only survived for 3 days. It was a tragedy that nearly broke us, a pain we buried deep and never spoke of again. Adrian was born 5 years later. She never knew she had a brother. Marlene had deliberately chosen the one agonizing piece of our shared history that our greedy daughter could never possibly guess or discover. The manager stood up, her demeanor shifting from suspicious to deeply apologetic. She guided me through the heavy steel gate of the vault, her heels clicking against the polished floor. We walked down a long, narrow corridor of identical metal doors until we reached our designated box. She inserted her master key. I turned Marlene's key, and the heavy door popped loose. The manager stepped out of the room, leaving me alone in the absolute silence of the vault. I pulled the long metal drawer out and placed it on the viewing table. I expected to find cash, family heirlooms, or perhaps old property deeds. Instead, the box was almost entirely empty. Sitting in the center of the velvet lining was a single black USB flash drive and a thick manila folder sealed with red wax. The front of the folder was stamped with severe legal warnings from a private offshore financial firm. I reached out and picked up the flash drive. A new immediate problem crashed into my mind. I could not take this home. Trevor was deeply paranoid about his failing business. He had recently upgraded the router in their house, boasting about how he could monitor every device connected to the network. If I plugged a strange encrypted USB drive into my laptop under his roof, his tracking software would flag it instantly. They would corner me in my own bedroom before I even had the chance to read a single file. I needed a computer that was completely untraceable, one not bound by their suffocating surveillance. I slid the thick manila envelope inside the inner lining of my jacket and buried the USB drive deep in my pocket. I pushed the empty metal box back into the wall, locked it, and walked out of the bank. I did not look back. I pulled my collar up against the chilling wind and began walking briskly toward the downtown public library. I had to know what Marlene was hiding, and I was running out of time. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the downtown public library, and the sudden quiet of the building washed over me. The air inside smelled of old paper and floor wax, a stark contrast to the suffocating panic I had felt just moments before in the bank vault. I kept my head down, hiding my face as I navigated past rows of dusty bookshelves. I needed a computer that was completely untraceable. I found a secluded terminal in the far back corner of the reference section, tucked away behind the microfiche cabinets, where no security cameras or passing patrons could easily see the screen. I sat down in the stiff wooden chair and pulled the black flash drive from my pocket. My hands were shaking so violently that I scratched the plastic casing against the metal port twice before it finally clicked into place. The computer recognized the device with a soft chime. A single window popped up on the monitor. There were no hidden folders, no complicated encryption software to bypass, and no passwords required. There was just one audio file sitting in the center of the screen. The file name was a string of numbers. I stared at the sequence, feeling the blood drain completely from my face. It was the exact date my wife passed away 4 years ago. I reached out and grabbed the cheap plastic headphones hanging from the side of the monitor. I plugged them into the jack and pressed the padded cups hard against my ears, desperate to block out the quiet hum of the library. I moved the mouse, hovered the cursor over the file, and clicked play. For the first few seconds, there was only the sound of rustling fabric and a muffled rhythmic tapping. Then a voice cut through the static. It was Marlene. The sound of her voice, crisp and sharp and full of life, hit my chest like a physical blow. I had not heard her speak in 4 years. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of her wash over me, but the warmth of hearing her again vanished almost instantly. She sounded furious. She was not speaking with the gentle tone she reserved for me. She was using her professional voice, the authoritative tone she had perfected over 35 years as a senior corporate accountant. I heard papers slamming against a hard surface. It sounded like our old kitchen table. Marlene was demanding answers. I listened as my late wife laid out a flawless financial audit. She was reading aloud from property records and bank statements she had quietly gathered. She demanded to know why there was a massive secondary mortgage taken out on our family home. She recited the exact loan origination numbers, the dates of the wire transfers, and the routing numbers of the offshore accounts where the funds had been illegally diverted. Nobody could hide missing numbers from Marlene. She had spent her entire career hunting down corporate discrepancies, and now she was hunting down the thieves living in our own house. Then I heard Trevor. My son-in-law sounded frantic. I could hear his heavy footsteps pacing back and forth across the kitchen tiles. He was stammering, trying to invent a plausible lie, trying to blame a banking error or identity theft. But Marlene cut him off. She told him she had already reviewed the physical loan origination documents from the county clerk. She told him she knew he had forged her signature, and my signature, to secure the massive loan against our fully paid-off home. She had the proof right there on the table. I heard Adrienne crying in the background. My daughter was sobbing, begging her mother to lower her voice, begging her not to call the police. Adrienne admitted that Trevor had lost a devastating amount of money in a string of failed commercial investments. She cried that they were just borrowing the equity to save Trevor from bankruptcy, promising they were going to pay it back before we ever noticed. Marlene did not waver. She told them they had committed federal fraud and elder abuse, and she was not going to let them destroy the financial security she and I had spent decades building. She announced she was calling the authorities right then and there to report the forged signatures. Then the audio captured a terrifying sound. It was a sudden sharp gasp from Marlene. The sound of a wooden chair scraping violently against the floor echoed through the headphones, followed immediately by a heavy, sickening thud. The papers scattered across the floor. Marlene began making awful, choked noises. She was struggling to breathe. She was having the massive medical event that the hospital later told me was sudden and completely unavoidable. I sat frozen in the library chair, my hands gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned white. I expected to hear Adrienne screaming for an ambulance. I expected to hear Trevor dialing emergency services. Instead, there was a horrifying, suffocating silence. The only sound was Marlene's labored, agonizing breaths as her body failed her. Adrienne panicked. She started crying harder, asking Trevor what they should do, saying her mother was turning pale and holding her chest. Then Trevor spoke. His voice was no longer frantic or defensive. It was entirely stripped of humanity. It was cold, calculated, and purely evil. He told Adrienne to step back. He told her not to touch the phone. I listened to my son-in-law hiss into the quiet room. He said the old woman found out they forged her signature to mortgage the house. He said she was going to send them both to federal prison. He told his own wife that this stroke was her mother's own fault for making a scene. He said if they called an ambulance now, she would survive. She would talk, and their lives would be over. He told Adrienne to just leave her on the floor. Adrienne whimpered. She cried that it was her mother. But Trevor reminded her about the fraud, about the debt, about the prison time they were facing. He told her to go upstairs and wait. The recording continued to play. I was forced to listen to the absolute darkest depths of human depravity. The audio captured over 30 agonizing minutes of my wife slowly dying on the floor of her own kitchen. 30 minutes where a single phone call could have saved her life. I listened to her breaths grow shallower. I listened to her struggle until the very end. While she was taking her last breaths, I could hear Trevor quietly shuffling around the kitchen, gathering up all the financial documents and forged papers Marlene had brought to confront them. He was cleaning the crime scene while his mother-in-law suffocated to death just feet away. By the time they finally faked a panicked call to the paramedics, putting on an award-winning performance of devastated family members discovering a tragedy, they had already destroyed the evidence. They thought they had gotten away with the perfect crime. They thought the secret died with her on that kitchen floor. They did not know Marlene had anticipated their deceit. They did not know she had slipped a digital voice recorder into her cardigan pocket before confronting them, ensuring that even if her body failed, her voice would survive. I pulled the headphones off my ears. My breathing was ragged, and my vision was blurred with hot, blinding tears. The grief that had weighed me down like an anchor for 4 long years evaporated in an instant. My wife did not die of natural causes. She did not slip away peacefully due to an unavoidable medical emergency. She was murdered by intentional malicious neglect. She was murdered by the daughter we raised and the man we welcomed into our family. I sat in the quiet library, staring at the blank computer screen, as a cold, absolute rage replaced every ounce of sorrow in my body. They had killed my wife for money. They had stolen our equity. And now, 4 years later, they were planning to lock me in a psychiatric ward to finish the job and claim whatever scraps I had left. I reached out and carefully ejected the flash drive from the computer, gripping it tightly in my palm. They thought they were dealing with a declining, defenseless old man. They were about to learn that they had just handed a loaded weapon to a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I slipped the black flash drive into my pocket and turned my attention to the thick manila envelope resting on the wooden library desk. The red wax seal on the back was stamped with a crest I did not recognize. I ran my thumb over the brittle wax. Marlene had always been a woman of uncompromising precision. She never left a single variable to chance, and she certainly never trusted digital security when it came to absolute permanence. I wedged my thumbnail under the flap and cracked the seal. The heavy paper tore with a sharp, dry sound that seemed entirely too loud in the silent reference section. I slid the contents onto the desk. There were dozens of pages printed on thick, watermarked legal paper. The header on the first document bore the name of a private wealth management firm based entirely outside the United States. I began to read, and with every line my late wife's absolute genius unspooled before my eyes. Marlene had known they were stealing long before the night she died. She had spent the last 6 months of her life quietly and methodically dismantling her own financial footprint. According to the ledger in front of me, she had liquidated her entire private stock portfolio, a separate account she had managed meticulously since the early 90s. She had not just moved the money. She had constructed a financial fortress. She funneled the capital through a series of anonymous shell corporations, eventually parking the bulk of our true wealth in an irrevocable blind trust located in a jurisdiction that explicitly refused to recognize American civil judgments or domestic medical power of attorney claims. The funds were completely untouchable. I turned to the second page. It was a certified summary of assets. There was over $3 million sitting safely out of Adrian and Trevor's reach. But that was not all. Marlene had also secured the deeds to 2 commercial properties she had purchased under a completely different corporate entity. They were properties I never even knew existed, generating a quiet, steady stream of massive passive income. She had effectively built an invisible empire, while our daughter and son-in-law were busy forging signatures for a fraction of that amount. A handwritten note from Marlene was clipped to the back of the ledger. Her sharp, angled letters practically jumped off the page. She wrote that she suspected Trevor was drowning in commercial debt and that Adrian was complicit in hiding his failures. She detailed how she had structured this offshore trust explicitly to bypass the standard probate process. She knew that if she passed away unexpectedly, Trevor would immediately try to use his influence over Adrian to seize our remaining assets. She wrote that the trust could only be activated by a specific sequence of legal filings, and she had provided the exact contact information for a heavily vetted international attorney who was waiting for my call. She had spent her final agonizing days ensuring that no matter what happened to her, I would never be left defenseless. A hot, burning sensation built in the back of my throat. I traced my fingers over her signature. She had fought a silent, solitary war to protect me, and she had ultimately died on our kitchen floor for it. The sheer magnitude of her sacrifice threatened to crush me right there in the library chair. But before the weight of that realization could pull me under, a sharp, sudden vibration against my thigh shattered the quiet. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. The screen lit up with a harsh, bright glare. It was an automated text message from my primary banking institution. The words on the screen were short, clinical, and devastating. Withdrawal alert. Your retirement checking account ending in 4402 has been debited $12,000. I stared at the glowing numbers, my mind struggling to process the information. $12,000 was not a random figure. It was the exact, to the penny, remaining balance of my liquid retirement funds. I opened my banking application and logged in with trembling fingers. The screen loaded, displaying a bleak, undeniable zero. My account had been completely drained. I clicked on the transaction details. The funds had not been transferred to pay a bill or cover a legitimate medical expense. They had been wired directly into an external business account, an account I instantly recognized as the primary operating fund for Trevor's failing commercial enterprise. The timing was not a coincidence. It was a calculated, synchronized attack. While I was sitting in the bank vault, uncovering the truth about my wife's murder, my daughter was actively neutralizing my ability to survive. Adrian had undoubtedly leveraged the same fraudulent medical security hold she placed on my safe deposit box to gain emergency conservatorship over my checking accounts. She had convinced a bank manager or a compromised physician that I was suffering from an acute cognitive crisis and could no longer be trusted to manage my own finances. They had forged the necessary authorizations, bypassed the standard security protocols, and siphoned the very last drop of my accessible money. I sat back in the wooden chair, the reality of my situation settling over me like a suffocating blanket. If I had not found Marlene's envelope today, I would currently be completely destitute. I would not have the funds to hire a lawyer, rent a hotel room, or even buy a meal. I would be entirely dependent on the two people who had gleefully watched my wife suffocate to death. The sheer brutality of their plan became horrifyingly clear. They were not just planning to force me into a nursing home to claim the house. They had stolen the very funds that would have been required to pay for a decent, humane facility. Without a single dollar to my name, the state would be forced to intervene. Adrian and Trevor intended to dump me in a severely underfunded government-run psychiatric ward, a place where heavily medicated patients were forgotten and ignored. They wanted me locked in a concrete room, stripped of my agency, unable to communicate with the outside world, while they sold my home and lived lavishly off the proceeds of their crimes. My hands stopped shaking. The profound, paralyzing grief that had haunted me for 4 years evaporated, replaced entirely by cold mechanical calculation. I had spent 3 decades working as a senior systems engineer. My entire professional life was dedicated to diagnosing catastrophic failures, isolating malicious intrusions, and systematically neutralizing threats. I did not look at my phone with despair. I looked at it as a breached firewall. Adrian and Trevor thought they were dealing with a frightened, declining old man who would simply weep when his bank card was declined. They thought I would crawl back to their sprawling suburban house and beg for an explanation. They assumed their fraudulent paperwork was an impenetrable shield. They had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding a flash drive containing a flawless audio recording of a first-degree murder. They had no idea I was sitting on millions of dollars in untraceable offshore assets. I carefully folded Marlene's documents and slid them back into the thick manila envelope. I tucked this package deep inside the inner lining of my jacket, pressing it flat against my ribs. I placed the black flash drive in my front pocket, running my thumb over the smooth plastic casing one last time. I closed the banking application on my phone and deliberately deleted the automated text message. I wiped down the library computer terminal, erasing my browsing history and ensuring I left absolutely no digital footprint behind. I pushed the heavy wooden chair back and stood up. The physical aches and pains in my joints, the heavy exhaustion that usually accompanied my 72 years, seemed completely gone. A strange, terrifying calm washed over me as I walked past the microfiche cabinets and headed toward the library exit. I could not simply march into the police station. Trevor was a manipulator, and Adrian had already established a documented paper trail claiming I was suffering from severe delusions. If I walked into a precinct raving about a 4-year-old murder and a stolen retirement fund, the authorities might just call my daughter to come pick up her confused father. I needed an airtight, undeniable legal strategy. I needed a professional who knew how to navigate the darkest, most aggressive corners of the judicial system. I needed my oldest friend, Nathaniel. Nathaniel was a ruthless commercial litigator who owed me a profound debt from 20 years ago. He was exactly the kind of man who would look at this situation not with pity, but with surgical aggression. But I could not go to Nathaniel just yet. If I vanished right after my bank account was drained, Adrian and Trevor would panic. They would suspect I had discovered their theft, and they might accelerate their timeline to have me physically detained. I needed to buy time. I needed to look the murderers in the eye and pretend they had won. I pushed through the library doors and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. I set my jaw and began the long walk back to the suburban house where my wife was killed. I was going to walk through their front door. I was going to play the confused, defeated old man they expected to see. And I was going to quietly, methodically, tear their entire world down to the studs. I stood at the end of the driveway, staring at the sprawling suburban house that had been my prison for 4 years. The faint, rhythmic thumping of bass reverberated through the thick mahogany front door. They were playing music. They were celebrating. On my long walk back from the library, I had made a single, untraceable detour. I paid cash at a specialized electronics supply store, 2 towns over, purchasing a high-frequency coin-sized audio transmitter and a paired receiver. As a former systems engineer, I knew exactly how to bug a room without leaving a digital signature on their heavily monitored home network. I slipped the tiny adhesive disc into the palm of my right hand and pushed the front door open. The smell of gourmet takeout and expensive champagne hit me the second I stepped into the foyer. Trevor was standing in the center of the kitchen, leaning against the marble island with a crystal flute in his hand. Adrienne was sitting on a bar stool across from him, her head thrown back in a joyous, carefree laugh. It was a sound I had not heard from my daughter in months. Trevor raised his glass, offering a toast to their sudden financial salvation. He boasted about finally securing the liquidity to close his commercial funding round, claiming his brilliant negotiating skills had saved the business. My stomach twisted with pure disgust. The brilliant negotiation he was celebrating was the fraudulent draining of my $12,000 retirement fund. They were drinking my life savings. Adrienne spotted me standing in the hallway shadows. Her laughter stopped instantly. The warmth vanished from her face, replaced by a tight, irritated scowl. She demanded to know where I had been all afternoon, her voice sharp and accusatory. She crossed her arms, asking why I had not left a note, treating me like a disobedient child who had broken curfew. It was time to perform. I let my shoulders slump forward, deliberately sinking into a fragile, defeated posture. I let my jaw tremble slightly as I looked around the kitchen, widening my eyes to mimic profound confusion. I mumbled that I had just gone out for a short walk to get some fresh air. I forced my voice to crack, whispering that I must have taken a wrong turn because the street suddenly looked unfamiliar. I rubbed my temples, acting as though a heavy fog had settled over my brain. Trevor let out a loud theatrical sigh. He muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if my mere presence was an exhausting burden. Adrian rolled her eyes, her irritation completely devoid of any genuine concern for a father who had supposedly just been wandering the streets lost. She pointed toward the hallway and told me to just go to my room and rest. She said they were dealing with important adult matters and did not have the energy to babysit me tonight. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. I shuffled toward the kitchen sink, dragging my feet against the hardwood to emphasize my physical decline. I reached into the cabinet with trembling fingers and pulled out a heavy glass tumbler. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run over the rim. I waited for Trevor to turn his back, to pour another round of champagne. I waited for Adrian to look down at her phone. Then I let my hand go entirely limp. The heavy glass slipped from my grip and crashed onto the floor. It shattered into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. Water splashed across the expensive hardwood, soaking into the grout. Adrian jumped off her bar stool, screaming in frustration. She threw her hands in the air, asking what was wrong with me. She yelled that I was becoming a massive liability, incapable of even pouring a glass of water without destroying something. Trevor stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. He told Adrian not to waste her breath. He pointed a finger at me and ordered me to get on my hands and knees and clean up the mess before the water ruined the floorboards. I did not argue. I lowered myself to the floor, letting my knees pop and groan. I grabbed a handful of paper towels and began wiping up the spilled water, keeping my head bowed in submission. I crawled forward, gathering the broken shards of glass, moving deliberately closer to the heavy oak dining table, sitting just behind the kitchen island. Adrian and Trevor completely ignored me. They turned back to their champagne, clinking their glasses together, dismissing me as nothing more than a pathetic, broken old man scrubbing the floor at their feet. They did not see my right hand reach up. I peeled the backing off the coin-sized audio transmitter. I pressed it firmly against the rough, unfinished wood, directly under the center of the dining table. I held it there for 3 seconds, ensuring the adhesive bonded perfectly to the grain. I finished wiping the floor, threw the damp paper towels and broken glass into the trash, and shuffled quietly down the hallway to my bedroom. I closed the door behind me and locked it. I sat down on the edge of my bed, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out the small black receiver and plugged a single earpiece into the jack. I pressed it into my ear and turned the volume dial up. The audio feed was crystal clear. I could hear the pop of another champagne cork. I could hear the clinking of crystal. And then I heard the unfiltered venomous truth. Trevor was laughing. He told Adrian that my little performance in the kitchen was the greatest gift I could have possibly given them. He said my declining coordination and blatant confusion were going to make the legal transition completely seamless. He boasted about how easy it had been to bypass the bank manager that afternoon, bragging that a few forged signatures and a fabricated tale of my cognitive collapse were all it took to empty my accounts. Adrian did not sound guilty. She sounded relieved. She took a sip of her drink and let out a long, satisfied sigh. She told Trevor that they were finally in the home stretch. She said she had already confirmed the appointment for tomorrow morning. My blood ran cold as I listened to my daughter outline the final phase of my execution. Adrian told Trevor she had secured a private consultation with a psychiatrist who was heavily sympathetic to their narrative. She admitted she had paid the doctor a massive off-the-books consultation fee, using the very funds they had just stolen from my retirement account. She said the doctor had already agreed to sign the emergency psychiatric evaluation. Trevor asked if the doctor would ask difficult questions. Adrian scoffed. She said the doctor did not care about the truth. He only cared about the retainer fee. She explained that tomorrow morning she was going to drive me to the clinic under the guise of a routine checkup. Once we were inside the examination room, the doctor would officially certify that I was suffering from advanced aggressive dementia. He would sign the binding medical affidavit declaring me an immediate danger to myself. Trevor chuckled, asking how quickly the paperwork would process. Adrian's voice dropped to a cold, predatory whisper. She told him the emergency guardianship would be permanent before noon. She said once the ink was dry, I would have zero legal rights. I would not be able to hire a lawyer, access a bank account, or even legally object to my own confinement. She said they already had a bed reserved at a state-run psychiatric facility 2 counties over. Adrian promised Trevor that by this time tomorrow, the old man would be locked in a secure ward, and they would have absolute uncontested legal authority to sell the house and liquidate every remaining asset to clear their commercial debt. I pulled the earpiece out. The silence of my bedroom felt suffocating. They were not planning to wait. The clock was not just ticking, it was already striking midnight. I had less than 18 hours before my own daughter dragged me into a rigged medical examination and legally erased my existence. If I got in that car tomorrow morning, I would never see the outside of a locked concrete ward again. I stood up from the bed. The time for gathering evidence was over. The time for hiding in the shadows was done. I reached into my jacket and felt the thick manila envelope Marlene had left me. I had the offshore trust. I had the audio recording of her murder. And now, I had the exact timeline of their final attack. I needed to move, and I needed to move with absolute devastating precision. The morning sun bled through the gaps in my bedroom blinds, but I had not slept a single minute. I sat fully dressed on the edge of my mattress, listening to the muffled sounds of the house waking up. Down the hall, I could hear my daughter pacing across the hardwood floor, her voice a sharp, urgent whisper. I pressed my ear against the cold wood of my bedroom door. She was on her cell phone with the corrupt psychiatrist, confirming the wire transfer from my stolen retirement account to cover his massive, off-the-books retainer fee. She told him I would be sitting in his examination room by 10 ratongs tomorrow morning, ready for my emergency psychiatric evaluation. My stomach tightened, but I refused to let the panic take hold. I checked my watch. It was just past 7. My son-in-law was in the master bathroom, the shower water running loudly through the pipes. I slipped the thick manila envelope containing my late wife's offshore trust documents inside my jacket. I grabbed the black flash drive and placed it carefully in my breast pocket. I opened my bedroom window as quietly as I could, stepping out into the damp morning grass of the backyard. I did not take the driveway. My son-in-law had installed a motion-activated security camera near the garage just last month. Instead, I unlatched the rusty wooden gate hidden behind the overgrown azalea bushes and slipped into the neighboring alleyway. I kept a brisk, steady pace until I was 3 blocks away, where I hailed a passing taxi and told the driver to take me straight to the commercial district downtown. I stood on the sidewalk, staring up at a towering structure of sleek glass and steel. This was the headquarters of the most ruthless, highly compensated commercial litigation firm in the state. I walked through the revolving doors and approached the sprawling marble reception desk. The young woman behind the counter asked if I had an appointment. I told her to call upstairs and say Desmond was here, to collect on a 20-year-old debt. She looked highly skeptical, but picked up her phone. Less than 2 minutes later, a set of heavy mahogany doors swung open down the hall. Nathaniel walked out, wearing a sharply tailored suit, his silver hair slicked back. Nathaniel and I went back decades, 20 years ago when he was just a junior partner, caught in the middle of a catastrophic corporate espionage case. I had used my systems engineering clearance to recover deleted server files that completely exonerated him and saved his entire career. He had looked me in the eye that day and promised that if I ever needed a shark, I had one on retainer for life. I walked past the receptionist and followed Nathaniel into his corner office, shutting the heavy wooden door firmly behind us. Nathaniel poured 2 cups of black coffee from a silver carafe on his credenza. He handed me a mug, taking in my disheveled appearance. He did not ask how the weather was. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He sat behind his massive desk and asked me who we were destroying today. I reached inside my jacket and pulled out the thick manila envelope Marlene had left me. I dropped it on the center of his polished desk, followed immediately by the black flash drive. I told him my wife had been murdered 4 years ago by my daughter and son-in-law. I told him they had drained my retirement accounts yesterday afternoon, and I told him that tomorrow morning they were dragging me to a corrupt doctor to have me permanently committed to a locked psychiatric ward. Nathaniel did not gasp. He did not offer useless expressions of shock or pity. The professional warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He picked up the manila envelope and cracked it open. I sat in silence as Nathaniel speed-read through my late wife's immaculate financial structuring. I watched his eyebrows rise as he analyzed the irrevocable blind trust she had established offshore. He murmured that the legal architecture of her trust was an absolute masterpiece, entirely immune to domestic guardianship claims. Then I told him to plug in the flash drive. He inserted it into his laptop and put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones. I watched his face as the audio played. I saw the exact moment he heard his friend Marlene fighting for her life on the kitchen floor. I saw his jaw clench so tight, a muscle ticked in his cheek, when my son-in-law ordered my daughter to let her die. When the recording finished, Nathaniel slowly pulled the headphones off and laid them on the desk. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated legal violence. He promised me that they were not just going to prison. He swore he would make sure they were stripped of every single asset, humiliated in open court, and left with absolutely nothing. But Nathaniel was a commercial litigator, not just a criminal prosecutor. He knew that people drowning in commercial debt always left a sloppy paper trail. He turned his monitor toward himself and started typing furiously into a premium legal database that tracked domestic property transfers, corporate filings, and escrow accounts. He ran my son-in-law's name, then my daughter's name, and finally my social security number. The rapid clicking of his keyboard suddenly stopped. Nathaniel leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing as he read through a freshly filed digital document. He swore under his breath, a sharp, bitter curse that made the hair on my arms stand up. He turned the monitor so I could see the screen. He told me the psychiatric evaluation tomorrow morning was not just about getting me out of the house. It was a distraction to cover up something much more immediate. I stared at the scanned document on the screen. It was a commercial real estate purchase agreement. The seller listed was me. The buyer was a limited liability shell company. I recognized the registered address of the shell company instantly. It was the exact same address as my son-in-law's failing commercial enterprise. Nathaniel pointed to the bottom of the document. My signature was perfectly forged on the seller line. They were not waiting for me to be committed to sell my house. They had already drafted the paperwork to secretly sell my primary residence to his own anonymous company for pennies on the dollar. By the time the state took over my guardianship inventory, the house would already be gone, buried behind a wall of corporate protection. Nathaniel tapped his pen against the desk, his voice incredibly grim. He told me the escrow sequence had already been initiated. He pointed to the digital timestamp at the top of the county clerk's filing page. He said the property transfer was in its final mandatory holding period. The deed would officially change hands and clear the county registry in exactly 48 hours. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was staggering. They had drained my liquid cash yesterday to pay the corrupt doctor. They were committing me tomorrow morning to physically remove me from the board. And less than 24 hours after I was locked in a psychiatric ward, my multi-million-dollar property would legally transfer into a hidden corporate portfolio. They had timed the entire assault perfectly, so that I would have no money to fight, no legal standing to object, and no physical freedom to intervene. If we simply went to the police right now with the audio recording, their lawyers would immediately stall the criminal investigation by presenting my daughter's forged medical affidavit, claiming I was suffering from severe paranoia and fabricating evidence. The police would have to investigate the authenticity of the tape, which would take weeks. Meanwhile, the 48-hour clock on the house transfer would expire. Once the property was completely absorbed by the shell company, they could instantly leverage the equity to secure a massive commercial loan, move the cash offshore, and completely bankrupt my estate before they ever saw the inside of a courtroom. I looked at Nathaniel, the cold realization settling between us. We could not just play defense. We had to use their own momentum against them. I told Nathaniel that my son-in-law thought he was operating in secret. He thought he was moving my assets into an untouchable corporate vault. I pointed at the screen, staring at the name of the shell company. I asked Nathaniel if Marlene's offshore trust contained enough liquid capital to execute a rapid, anonymous corporate acquisition. Nathaniel's eyes widened as he realized exactly what I was suggesting. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He pulled the ledger back across the desk and started running the numbers. He told me that with the specialized power of attorney documents Marlene had placed in the vault, he could grant me full, uncontested executive control over her international funds within the hour. We were going to buy the debt of that shell company, completely swallowing his business from the outside in. Before Nathaniel could finalize the wire transfer sequence, my phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Adrian. The words on the screen were impatient and demanding. She asked where I was. She told me the doctor was already waiting at the house for a preliminary consultation, and I needed to come back immediately. She added a sickeningly sweet lie, saying they were just worried about my health and wanted to make sure I was okay. The threat beneath her words was crystal clear. If I did not walk back through that front door right now, she would call the local authorities, report a confused senior citizen wandering the streets, and use the police report as definitive proof of my cognitive collapse. I showed the message to Nathaniel. The clock had not just started, it was actively running out. I had to go back into the lion's den and smile at the people trying to destroy me, completely unprotected until the financial trap was set. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the threatening words from my daughter burning into my retinas. Nathaniel leaned across his polished mahogany desk, reading the message over my shoulder. His jaw tightened. I told him we could not simply call the police and hand over the flash drive right now. Adrian had already wired my stolen retirement funds to a corrupt psychiatrist who was currently sitting in my living room, ready to sign a fabricated medical affidavit. If uniformed officers showed up at the house, my daughter would weep crocodile tears, hand them a legally binding document declaring me severely delusional, and claim my accusations of murder and fraud were aggressive hallucinations. The police would have no choice but to dismiss my claims and likely assist her in transporting me to the psychiatric ward. I was legally cornered. In Nathaniel's office, the realization of our vulnerability demanded immediate aggressive action. I explained to Nathaniel that Adrian and Trevor believed they were untouchable because they controlled the local narrative. They controlled the house, the stolen retirement funds, and the medical records. But they did not control the macro-commercial markets. Trevor had leveraged his logistics enterprise to the absolute breaking point. Nathaniel accessed a secure banking portal, bypassing standard regulatory delays through his firm's premium institutional clearance. He located the specific high-risk lending syndicate that held the primary lien on Trevor's shell company. The debt was massive, totaling well over $250,000 in defaulted commercial paper. Nathaniel did not hesitate. Drawing directly from the offshore trust Marlene had meticulously prepared, he executed a hostile anonymous buyout of the entire debt portfolio. He routed the capital through a newly established holding entity, a shadow corporation, entirely under my control. Within a matter of minutes, the digital transaction cleared the international wire protocols. I was no longer a helpless victim, watching my assets disappear. I was now the sole undisputed master creditor of my son-in-law's entire financial existence. Trevor was currently standing in my kitchen, drinking champagne and celebrating the fraudulent acquisition of my home, completely unaware that I now legally owned the corporate structure he was trying to save. Nathaniel printed a thick stack of acquisition summaries, sliding them into a secure leather portfolio. He looked across the desk, his expression hardening. He warned me that the financial snare was set, but it was not yet actionable. The commercial buyout required a mandatory 24-hour processing window to clear domestic regulatory filings. During that window, Trevor and Adrian still held the forged deed to my house, and they still controlled the corrupt psychiatrist waiting in my living room. Nathaniel made it explicitly clear that I had to return to the suburban house and play along. I had to endure their psychological torture and let them believe their medical trap was closing around me. The physical toll of the last 48 hours threatened to drag me under. The thought of sitting across from the people who murdered my wife, pretending to be a broken, confused old man, made my stomach violently churn. I asked Nathaniel, what would happen if the corrupt doctor ordered an immediate involuntary psychiatric hold? I asked what would stop them from throwing me into a transport vehicle the second I walked through the front door. Nathaniel opened his desk drawer and handed me a small, encrypted GPS tracking device, no larger than a key fob. He instructed me to wedge it deep beneath the insole of my left boot. He swore that if they attempted to move me to a locked facility before our financial strike finalized, he would file an emergency federal injunction, bypass the local courts entirely, and tear the hospital apart with a swarm of corporate litigators. I slipped the tracker into my boot, the hard plastic pressing reassuringly against my heel. My cell phone vibrated violently against my thigh. It was another text message from my daughter. The words on the screen were impatient, aggressive, and thinly veiled with a horrific fake concern. She demanded to know my exact location. She warned me that if I did not walk through the front door in the next 15 minutes, she was calling emergency dispatch to report a wandering, severely disoriented senior citizen. She explicitly stated she would tell the police I was a danger to myself, establishing a documented paper trail of my supposed cognitive collapse. I had absolutely no margin for error. I buttoned my jacket, feeling the thick manila envelope hidden safely against my ribs. I left the towering glass building and climbed into the back of a discreet black town car Nathaniel had arranged. The ride back to the suburbs was agonizingly quiet. The transition from the towering, sterile skyscrapers of the financial district back to the manicured, tree-lined streets of my neighborhood felt surreal. Behind the perfectly trimmed hedges and expansive green lawns hid the absolute darkest depths of human greed. The driver parked at the end of my street. I told him I would walk the rest of the way. I needed a moment to control my breathing, to force my body to mimic the frail, declining posture my murderers expected to see. I stepped onto the pavement, letting my shoulders slump heavily forward. I dragged my boots slightly, practicing the hesitant, shuffling gait of a defeated man losing his grip on reality. I approached the concrete driveway of the house I had paid off decades ago, the house where my wife had taken her last agonizing breaths. Trevor's luxury sports car was parked haphazardly near the garage, a blatant, arrogant display funded entirely by my stolen retirement savings. Right behind it sat a sleek, unmarked silver sedan. The executioner had arrived. The corrupt doctor was waiting inside. I walked up the front steps, my heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I reached out and turned the brass doorknob. The door was unlocked. I stepped into the foyer, the air inside the house feeling impossibly thick and heavy. I shuffled slowly into the living room, keeping my head bowed, my eyes darting nervously around the space. Adrian was perched on the edge of the velvet sofa, her legs crossed, a mask of profound, fabricated anxiety plastered across her face. Sitting in the leather armchair directly across from her was a man I had never seen before. He wore an immaculate gray suit and held a thick medical clipboard resting on his knee. He had the polished, practiced demeanor of a professional who was highly accustomed to getting paid a fortune to look the other way. Trevor was standing by the stone fireplace, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He glared at me with an expression of sheer, unadulterated contempt, quickly replacing it with a look of heavy, burdened concern. As he turned toward the doctor, he announced that I had been wandering the streets for hours, claiming I frequently forgot where I lived and constantly invented paranoid delusions about my money. Adrian stood up, rushing over to me with outstretched arms. She grabbed my shoulders, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully through my cardigan. She asked me where I had been, in a loud, slow, patronizing voice, speaking to me as if I were a confused toddler. I looked at my daughter, seeing the absolute void of humanity behind her panicked performance. I let my jaw slacken. I mumbled that I had just gone for a walk to clear my head, forcing my voice to tremble and break. I claimed I had taken the wrong turn and gotten lost among the street signs. The corrupt doctor clicked his pen, scribbling a rapid, decisive note on his clipboard. He did not stand up to greet me. He did not ask how I was feeling or attempt to assess my baseline vital signs. He simply watched me, with cold, calculating eyes, mentally cashing the massive retainer fee Adrian had wired him from my stolen accounts. He leaned forward, his voice a smooth, practiced hum. He introduced himself as a specialist in geriatric cognitive care. He claimed my daughter was deeply devastated by my declining safety and had brought him in to conduct a preliminary assessment to ensure I was receiving the proper support. I knew exactly what that word meant. The support he was referring to was a locked metal door in a state-run psychiatric ward. Adrian guided me to the sofa, forcing me to sit down. She sat right beside me, wrapping her arm around my shoulders in a suffocating, inescapable embrace. She looked at the doctor with tears welling in her eyes, softly stating that she was terrified I was going to hurt myself. She claimed I had been hallucinating, making wild, aggressive accusations against her and Trevor regarding their finances. The doctor nodded sympathetically, turning over a fresh page on his clipboard. He looked me dead in the eye and asked me to tell him what year it was. The trap was wide open. I had to step willingly inside, armed with nothing but the devastating secret burning in my pocket. I looked at the corrupt doctor's polished leather shoes, letting a long, vacant silence stretch across the living room. He had just asked me what year it was. I let my lower lip tremble. I furrowed my brow, glancing nervously at the stone fireplace, as if I had never seen it before. I told him it was 1998. Adrian let out a loud theatrical sob. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with manufactured grief. The doctor did not even blink at her terrible acting. He simply clicked his silver pen and checked a heavy black box on his evaluation form. He asked me to name the current president. I stared blankly at the coffee table and gave him the name of a man who had been out of office for 2 decades. I slurred my words, slightly dropping my chin toward my chest. I began to pick nervously at a loose thread on my cardigan, playing the exact role of a frightened, deteriorating mind. Trevor paced behind the sofa, practically vibrating with excitement. He pointed at me, telling the doctor that I had been doing this all week. He claimed I was leaving the stove on, forgetting my own daughter's name, and becoming aggressively paranoid about my bank accounts. The doctor nodded smoothly, never bothering to check my pupils, test my reflexes, or ask a single follow-up question. He had been paid to deliver a specific diagnosis, and he was executing his end of the transaction flawlessly. The doctor flipped to the final page of his thick clipboard. He pulled out a red legal stamp and pressed it hard against the paper. He signed his name with a rapid, illegible scrawl. He handed the clipboard to Adrian. He stated formally that he was certifying me as suffering from acute advanced dementia with severe paranoid delusions. He declared me an immediate, unavoidable danger to myself. Adrian wiped a non-existent tear from her cheek. She thanked him profusely, asking when the transport team would arrive. The doctor told her the medical courier service was booked for tomorrow evening, right in the middle of the large birthday dinner she had supposedly organized for me. It was a brilliantly sadistic logistical move. They were going to have me hauled away in front of a house full of extended family and business partners, using the crowd as unwitting witnesses to my sad, inevitable decline. No one would question the narrative if they saw me being gently escorted out of my own birthday party by uniformed medical professionals. Adrian stood up, gripping my arm tightly. She hauled me off the sofa, speaking to me in a loud, patronizing tone. She told me it was time for a nap. She marched me down the hallway, shoved me into my bedroom, and pulled the door shut. The heavy metallic slide of the exterior deadbolt echoed through the wood. I was locked in. The second the lock clicked into place, my trembling posture vanished. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back to release the agonizing tension. I did not waste a single second. I dropped to my knees and reached deep under my mattress, pulling out a heavy, outdated laptop I had hidden there months ago. It was a bulky, obsolete machine that Trevor had discarded, assuming it was broken. He did not know that a former systems engineer could easily strip a corrupted hard drive, rebuild the motherboard, and install a localized encrypted operating system. I booted the machine. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across the darkened bedroom. I did not connect to their heavily monitored home network. I pulled a prepaid, untraceable cellular hotspot from my sock drawer, a device Nathaniel had slipped into my coat pocket just hours earlier. I established a secure, encrypted tunnel directly to the offshore financial portal Marlene had created. My fingers flew across the worn plastic keyboard. The muscle memory of 30 years spent writing code, diagnosing system failures, and executing complex digital commands flooded back into my hands. I bypassed the standard login, utilizing the master executive bypass codes Marlene had left in her ledger. The offshore trust account materialized on the screen. Over $3 million in untraceable liquid capital sat waiting for my command. I pulled up the digital acquisition portfolio Nathaniel had drafted. Trevor's entire commercial logistics enterprise was built on a foundation of sand. He had leveraged his fleet of trucks, his warehouse leases, and his personal equity to secure a massive amount of high-risk mezzanine debt. He was drowning in defaulted commercial paper held by a faceless lending syndicate. I initiated the hostile buyout protocol. I routed the capital through the shadow holding company Nathaniel and I had established that afternoon. I watched the loading bars creep across the screen, the digital progress illuminating my face in the dark room. I was authorizing the immediate full cash purchase of Trevor's entire debt portfolio. I was not buying his company. I was buying his survival. I clicked the final authorization prompt. The screen froze for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, a bright green confirmation text flashed across the monitor. Transaction complete. The money shifted across international lines, moving faster than human comprehension. I sat back on the floor, staring at the screen. The reality of the digital ink drying was absolute. Trevor no longer owed a massive indifferent banking conglomerate. He now owed an anonymous corporate entity. He owed me. I was officially the supreme creditor of his entire existence. If he missed a single covenant, if he failed to make a single predatory interest payment, I possessed the unilateral legal authority to seize every single asset tied to his name. That included the fraudulent shell company he had just used to illegally purchase my house. He had stolen my retirement fund to buy the property. But I had just bought the man himself. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. The deadbolt on my bedroom door slammed open. I slammed the laptop shut and shoved it violently under the mattress, throwing myself back onto the edge of the bed just a fraction of a second before the door swung wide. Trevor stood in the doorway, reeking of expensive bourbon and unchecked arrogance. His tie was loosened, his face flushed with the thrill of his perceived victory. He was holding a stack of glossy printed brochures. He threw them onto my bed. They scattered across the quilt. They were pamphlets for a bleak state-funded psychiatric facility located 2 counties over. He leaned against the doorframe, a cruel mocking smirk twisting his features. He told me to start packing a bag. He boasted that tomorrow night the transport team was going to strap me to a gurney and wheel me out the front door in front of all our guests. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, malicious whisper. He told me that once I was locked in that concrete ward, they were going to sell everything I owned, strip this house down to the studs, and I would never see the sunlight again. I looked down at the glossy pamphlets, then slowly raised my eyes to meet his. I did not cower. I did not let my lip tremble. I looked at the man who had ordered my wife to be left to die on the kitchen floor. I looked at the man who currently believed he was a financial genius, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the digital leash around his neck. I did not say a word. I simply offered him a faint, chilling smile. Trevor's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, unsettled by my absolute silence, before he scoffed, slammed the door shut, and locked the deadbolt once again. He thought he was locking me in. He had no idea he had just locked himself inside a burning building. The morning sun cast long, barred shadows across the glossy psychiatric facility pamphlets scattered across my quilt. I had spent the remainder of the night sitting perfectly still in the dark, listening to the heavy silence of the locked house. Downstairs, the sharp thud of the front door closing signaled my daughter's departure. Through the audio receiver transmitting from the bug planted under the dining room table, I had heard her boasting to her husband just minutes prior. She was heading to the most exclusive boutique district in the city to purchase high-end catering, vintage champagne, and a new designer dress for my birthday party tonight. She was funding this morbid celebration using a platinum supplementary credit card tied directly to my name, a card she had forcefully demanded a year ago under the guise of buying emergency household groceries. She was throwing a lavish party to celebrate my permanent confinement, and she was making me pay for it. I dragged my obsolete laptop back out from its hiding place under the mattress. The encrypted cellular hotspot connected instantly to the secure server. I bypassed the offshore trust portal and accessed the primary dashboard of my domestic financial portfolio. While Nathaniel had already orchestrated the corporate buyout of my son-in-law's commercial debt offshore, my domestic credit lines were still technically active. I brought up the live transaction ledger on my screen. A pending authorization for $4,000 popped up at a high-end French bakery. 2 minutes later, another authorization for $6,000 flashed from a luxury jeweler. She was bleeding the credit line dry, eagerly liquidating my assets before I was even strapped to the medical gurney. I moved the cursor to the master administrative controls. I did not simply click the button to temporarily freeze the accounts. I initiated a catastrophic federal fraud protocol. I flagged every single supplementary card issued under my Social Security number as stolen by a malicious domestic actor. I initiated a hard, irreversible lock that required my physical presence and a government identity verification to lift. The digital command shot through the banking mainframe with absolute finality. I closed the laptop, shoved it back under the mattress, and pushed the small black receiver deep into my ear. The audio feed crackled to life. I heard the muffled, chaotic background noise of an upscale retail store, captured through the microphone on my daughter's cell phone when she frantically called her husband. She was hyperventilating. Her voice was shrill, echoing with the absolute panic of a woman experiencing public humiliation for the first time in her pampered life. She screamed that the cashier at the designer boutique had just cut her platinum card in half, right in front of a line of wealthy customers. The bank had flagged her as an active fraud risk. She was stranded at the checkout counter with $10,000 worth of merchandise and a store manager actively threatening to call local law enforcement if she did not produce a valid form of payment or leave the premises immediately. My son-in-law's response over the phone was not comforting. He sounded utterly unhinged. He yelled that his own corporate cards were suddenly declining across the board. He did not know that Nathaniel's shadow corporation was currently freezing his commercial credit as part of our hostile debt acquisition. But the financial strangulation was happening simultaneously and brutally. He demanded to know if she had messed up the psychiatric evaluation paperwork, accusing her of triggering an automatic protective freeze by filing the medical incompetence forms too early. He cursed violently, telling her to abandon the merchandise, swallow her pride, and get back to the house immediately. He said he needed my signature right now to override the domestic fraud alert before the banks locked them out of the house equity completely. I pulled the earpiece out and quickly hid it in my pocket. I barely had time to sit back down on the edge of the bed and adopt my fragile, slumped posture before the heavy deadbolt on my bedroom door violently snapped open. My son-in-law burst into the room. His face was flushed a deep mottled red, and the veins in his neck were bulging against his collar. The arrogant, mocking smirk he had worn the night before was entirely gone. He was sweating, breathing heavily, gripping a thick stack of legal documents so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He did not bother pretending to be a concerned family member. He marched across the bedroom and slammed the papers down onto my lap. He shoved a heavy silver pen into my chest. He barked that the bank had triggered an automated security hold because of the medical evaluation, and I needed to sign a full, unconditional financial power of attorney to clear the red tape. The lie was incredibly sloppy, born of absolute desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at my face, dropping his voice to a vicious, guttural growl. He explicitly threatened that if I did not sign the dotted line right this second, he would personally ensure the psychiatric transport team, coming tonight, bypassed the comfortable state facility. He promised to bribe the drivers to drop me in the most violent, criminally underfunded asylum in the state, a concrete box where I would be heavily sedated and forgotten forever. I looked down at the documents resting on my knees. This was the final desperate lunge of a dying predator. He needed this signature to bypass the fraud alerts and legally liquidate the domestic assets before his commercial world completely collapsed. He thought he was holding a gun to my head. He had no idea my lawyer and I had meticulously planned for this exact moment. Yesterday, in the safety of the towering glass financial building, Nathaniel had drilled me for an hour on the specific legal mechanics of a voided signature. I let my hands shake violently as I reached for the silver pen. I looked up at the man who had murdered my wife, widening my eyes to mimic profound, paralyzing terror. I let out a soft, pathetic whimper, acting as if his threat had completely broken my spirit. I uncapped the pen, hovering the tip over the signature line. I did not sign my actual name. I deliberately altered the loop of the first letter, inverted the slant of my surname, and omitted the middle initial I had used on every legal document for the past 50 years. To the untrained eye, it looked like the messy, deteriorating handwriting of an old man losing his motor functions. To a forensic document examiner, it was a blatant, deliberate forgery that completely legally invalidated the entire contract. He snatched the papers off my lap the second the ink dried. He did not even review the signature. He was too blinded by panic and greed to notice the deliberate structural flaws in the cursive. He let out a harsh, breathless laugh, clutching the documents to his chest like a life preserver. He looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He told me to put on a nice suit and be ready by 6 o'clock. He said I was going to sit quietly through my birthday dinner, smile for the guests, and then walk out the front door with the orderlies, without making a single sound. He spun on his heel and marched out of the room, slamming the door and locking the deadbolt once again. I listened to his heavy footsteps sprint down the hallway toward his home office. He was going to spend the rest of the afternoon frantically faxing that voided document to the banks, completely unaware that he was submitting explicit documented evidence of financial coercion across state lines. He thought he had just secured the key to his salvation. He did not know he had just handed me the final necessary nail for his coffin. The birthday party was only a few hours away, and the stage was perfectly set for their total destruction. The heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the hollow door. Trevor had his voided signature, leaving me alone in the dim afternoon light. I pulled the audio earpiece from my pocket and pushed it deep into my ear. The feed from the dining room was already buzzing. I listened to Trevor practically sprinting down the hallway, his voice breathless, as he called his commercial lender to fax the forged power of attorney. He was arrogant, entirely convinced he had just bypassed the federal fraud alert. I sat perfectly still on the edge of my mattress, listening to him seal his own fate. Within the hour, the muted sounds of a suburban household were replaced by the sharp clatter of high-end event catering. Heavy vans idled in the driveway. Footsteps pounded across the hardwood floors as workers rushed to assemble folding tables and arrange floral centerpieces. Adrienne barked orders at the staff, her voice shrill and demanding. She complained about the placement of the ice sculpture and criticized the lighting. She was spending thousands of dollars to construct a flawless facade for her wealthy neighbors and Trevor's anxious investors. She needed the ambiance to be absolutely perfect when the psychiatric transport team arrived tonight. Through the static of the receiver, I heard Trevor on the phone with one of his primary business partners. He poured himself another glass of champagne, adopting a tone of heavy manufactured sorrow. He told the investor that tonight was going to be an emotional evening. He lied through his teeth, claiming my mental faculties had completely deteriorated over the past few weeks. He painted a tragic picture of a man who no longer recognized his own family, saying they had made the agonizing decision to transition me into full-time memory care. He promised his investors that once I was safely relocated, my assets would be fully liquidated. The lock on my bedroom door clicked open. I ripped the earpiece out and shoved it under the mattress, dropping my chin to my chest just as Adrian pushed into the room. She was holding a freshly pressed charcoal suit encased in a plastic dry cleaning bag. She wore a stunning crimson designer gown, the fabric shimmering under the overhead light. She looked entirely immaculate, completely devoid of any guilt or hesitation. She draped the suit over the back of my desk chair and sighed, crossing her arms. She told me the guests were starting to arrive, and I needed to make myself presentable. I kept my eyes fixed on the floorboards. I let my hands shake as I reached out to touch the suit jacket. I offered a quiet, confused apology, asking her if it was Sunday. Adrian's expression hardened with profound disgust. She snapped that it was Friday, the night of my birthday dinner, and told me to stop acting pathetic. She warned me not to embarrass her in front of Trevor's partners. She explicitly ordered me to smile, sit quietly at the head of the table, and not speak unless spoken to. I offered her a meek, trembling nod. She turned on her heel and marched back out. I stood up and walked over to the chair. I stripped off my worn cardigan and began dressing for my execution. I pulled the crisp white shirt over my shoulders, buttoning it with steady, deliberate precision. I slipped into the charcoal trousers and fastened my belt. I walked over to the small standing mirror in the corner of the room. The man staring back at me did not look like a frail, declining victim. I looked exactly like the senior systems engineer who used to walk into hostile corporate boardrooms and systematically dismantle failing networks. I reached under the mattress and retrieved the black flash drive containing my late wife's murder. I slid it deep into my breast pocket. Next, I took the thick manila envelope containing the offshore trust ledgers and the proof of Trevor's corporate debt acquisition. I folded the heavy legal paper carefully, tucking it inside the inner lining of my suit jacket. It rested flat against my ribs, a hidden shield of absolute financial supremacy. I checked my watch. It was 6:15. The dull roar of conversation and clinking glassware drifted up the staircase. The guests were mingling in the foyer. The stage was completely set. I took one final deep breath, letting the cold mechanical logic of my professional training override any lingering trace of paternal grief. I stepped out of the bedroom and walked down the hallway. I did not shuffle. I did not hunch my shoulders. I walked with the measured, commanding stride of a man entirely in control of his environment. As I reached the top of the grand staircase, I looked down at the sea of people gathered in my living room. There were at least 50 guests, dressed in expensive cocktail attire, holding crystal flutes and balancing hors d'oeuvres on porcelain plates. Trevor was standing near the stone fireplace, holding court with a group of older men in tailored suits. He was shaking hands, laughing, playing the role of the tragic but resilient son-in-law to perfection. Adrian was standing near the kitchen island, chatting with the wives of Trevor's investors. She glanced up and caught sight of me descending the stairs. For a fraction of a second, her smile faltered. She noticed that I was not dragging my feet. She noticed that I was not staring blankly at the walls, but she quickly recovered, plastering a look of bittersweet affection across her face. She raised her glass, tapping a silver spoon against the rim to command the room's attention. The lively chatter died down instantly. All 50 pairs of eyes turned upward to watch me navigate the final steps. Adrian stepped forward, addressing the crowd with a practiced theatrical waver in her voice. She thanked everyone for coming to celebrate my 72nd birthday. She placed a hand over her heart, telling the room that tonight was incredibly special, but also incredibly difficult. She claimed that my health had taken a drastic, unforeseen turn over the last few weeks. She lied beautifully, saying that my cognitive abilities had deteriorated to the point where I required professional round-the-clock intervention. She announced that a specialized medical transport team would be arriving at the end of the evening to transition me into a permanent care facility. A collective murmur of sympathetic pity rippled through the guests. Several women placed their hands over their mouths, shaking their heads in manufactured sorrow. The men beside Trevor offered him solemn pats on the back, murmuring their condolences for the heavy burden he was supposedly carrying. They looked at me as if I were already a ghost, a tragic shell of a man, entirely unaware of my own surroundings. Trevor stepped forward to join his wife, wrapping a supportive arm around her waist. He looked up at me with an expression of profound, arrogant triumph. He thought I was walking to my grave. I stopped at the bottom of the staircase, standing perfectly still on the polished hardwood floor. I looked at the dozens of strangers mourning my fabricated decline. I looked at the daughter, who had watched her mother suffocate on the kitchen floor. I looked at the man who had stolen my retirement fund to save his fraudulent commercial empire. My hand brushed against the breast pocket of my suit jacket, feeling the hard plastic outline of the flash drive. The psychiatric transport van was currently navigating the suburban streets, heading straight for this address to lock me away forever. I had mere minutes before the orderlies walked through the front door with heavy sedatives and a straitjacket. I did not retreat. I stepped directly into the center of the living room, parting the sea of guests. The crowd instinctively stepped back, giving me a wide, cautious berth. Trevor's triumphant smile began to stiffen at the edges. He expected me to sit quietly in the corner armchair. He expected me to stare at the floor and wait for the men in white uniforms to take me away. Instead, I walked straight toward the massive flat-screen television mounted above the stone fireplace, right where Trevor had connected his laptop to display a slideshow of fabricated happy family photos. Adrian's voice hitched nervously. She took a step toward me, reaching out to grab my elbow. She asked me what I was doing, her tone dropping its sweet facade for a sharp, panicked whisper. She ordered me to go sit down before I made a scene. I ignored her entirely. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the black flash drive. I held it up so the overhead lights caught the plastic casing. The time for hiding was completely over. The execution block was fully assembled, and it was time to drop the blade. The sharp, aggressive ringing of a silver spoon striking a crystal champagne flute sliced through the heavy tension in the living room. Trevor had seen the black plastic flash drive resting in the palm of my hand. For a microsecond, a flash of genuine, unfiltered panic widened his eyes. He realized I was not following the script of the defeated, compliant victim he had locked in a bedroom all afternoon. He needed to seize control of the narrative before I could utter a single word to the dozens of wealthy investors and business partners mingling in his foyer. He stepped directly into the center of the room, physically blocking the crowd's view of the massive flat-screen television mounted above the stone fireplace. He forced a heavy, deeply sorrowful smile onto his face, seamlessly slipping into his role as the burdened, exhausted son-in-law, making the ultimate sacrifice for his family. The lively chatter of the cocktail party died down instantly. 50 pairs of eyes turned away from me and focused entirely on Trevor. He lowered his champagne flute, letting his shoulders slump just enough to convey a manufactured sense of profound exhaustion. He spoke loudly, his voice thick with a perfectly modulated theatrical grief. He thanked his primary investors, his extended relatives, and the neighbors for gathering tonight. He claimed that this evening was supposed to be a joyous celebration of my 72nd birthday, but unfortunately, it had to serve as a painful, necessary farewell. He wove a magnificent, devastating lie, stating that my cognitive health had plummeted irreversibly over the last month. He wiped a non-existent tear from the corner of his eye, telling the silent, captivated audience how devastating it had been to watch a brilliant systems engineer completely lose his mind to the ravages of aggressive dementia. I stood perfectly still at the bottom of the grand staircase, listening to my son-in-law assassinate my character in real time. I watched the wealthy investors and their wives swallow every single poisonous word. Women in expensive cocktail dresses clutched their pearl necklaces, offering soft, sympathetic sighs. Men in tailored suits nodded gravely, their faces reflecting a deep, solemn respect for Trevor's willingness to make the tough but necessary choices. Trevor gestured toward me with his free hand, using my silent stance as a live prop for his manufactured tragedy. He lowered his voice to a gentle, patronizing hum. He told the crowd that I was currently experiencing an active delusion. He pointed directly at the black flash drive resting in my palm, claiming I was wandering around the party, holding on to random pieces of garbage, completely disconnected from reality, and entirely unaware of my own surroundings. Trevor did not stop there. He leaned into the performance, announcing the imminent arrival of the psychiatric transport team. He told the hushed room that a specialized medical courier service was scheduled to arrive at any moment. He painted a horrific picture of my supposed decline, claiming I was leaving the stove on, forgetting my own daughter's name, and becoming violently paranoid. He said they had made the agonizing decision to transition me into a permanent locked memory care facility for my own safety. He asked the guests to be patient and understanding if I became confused or agitated when the orderlies arrived to escort me out. He then raised his champagne glass toward the kitchen island, publicly praising his brave wife for making the ultimate heartbreaking sacrifice to ensure her father received round-the-clock professional intervention. Adrian took her cue perfectly. She stepped away from the kitchen counter, her crimson designer gown rustling softly against the polished hardwood floor. Her face was a masterclass in angelic sorrow. She moved toward me with slow, exaggerated caution, keeping her hands outstretched as if she were approaching a frightened, unpredictable animal. I could smell the overpowering scent of her expensive perfume as she closed the distance between us. She stopped right in front of me, her eyes brimming with fake, carefully controlled tears for the benefit of the watching crowd. She reached out and gripped my forearm. Her fingers dug into my skin through the fabric of my suit jacket with a vicious, bruising intensity that completely betrayed her gentle facade. She murmured in a sickening, patronizing pitch, loud enough for the closest investors to hear. She told me it was time to go upstairs and rest my head before the doctors arrived. Then she dropped her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper, intended only for my ears. She ordered me to drop the piece of plastic and walk away before she had the transport team sedate me, right there on the floor. She shifted her grip, attempting to pry the black flash drive out of my clenched fingers. I did not drop the drive. I did not let her take it. As her perfectly manicured fingernails scraped against my knuckles, I locked my eyes onto hers. The cold mechanical logic of my professional training surged through my veins, overriding any lingering trace of paternal hesitation. I violently slapped her hand away. The sharp physical smack of skin against skin echoed like a gunshot in the sudden, suffocating silence of the living room. Adrian stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping against the polished wood. Her mouth dropped open in genuine, unadulterated shock. The sorrowful, grieving mask shattered instantly, revealing a flash of absolute terrified panic. She had expected me to cower, She had expected me to fold under the threat of chemical sedation. She had never expected me to fight back in front of her most important financial lifelines. I turned away from my daughter and faced the crowd of 50 silent, staring guests. I did not hunch my shoulders. I did not let my jaw tremble or my gaze wander. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back to my full height. I spoke with the booming, authoritative resonance I used to command hostile corporate boardrooms. My voice did not shake. It cut through the room with absolute, undeniable clarity. I thanked Trevor for his incredibly moving speech. I projected my words across the foyer, ensuring that every single investor, partner, and relative heard the crisp, lucid articulation of my syllables. I thanked him for gathering all of his primary financial backers in one room on such short notice. I stated that his dedication to my well-being was truly a marvel to witness. The shock on the investors' faces was immediate and palpable. They shifted uncomfortably, exchanging confused glances as they realized the man standing before them was not a babbling, deteriorating husk. I was entirely coherent, fiercely articulate, and radiating a dangerous, calculating energy. I stepped around Adrian and walked directly toward the center of the room. Trevor froze by the stone fireplace. He tried to shift his weight to block my path to the media console, but the sheer, unwavering confidence in my stride made him hesitate for a crucial fraction of a second. That single second of doubt was all I needed. I reached the side of the massive flat-screen television mounted above the mantel. I found the open USB port on the side panel and shoved the drive firmly into the slot. The hardware clicked into place with a satisfying metallic snap. Trevor's face drained of all color, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He dropped his champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the stone hearth, the expensive liquor splashing across his polished leather shoes. He lunged forward, barking at me to step away from the electronics, his voice cracking with sudden, uncontrollable terror. He finally realized this was not a symptom of cognitive decline. He realized I was executing a deliberate, highly coordinated digital strike. But I had already grabbed the smart remote, resting on the edge of the mantel. My thumbs moved with the rapid, flawless precision of a man who had spent 3 decades engineering complex software interfaces. I bypassed the standard menu screens, navigated directly to the external storage directory, and selected the single unencrypted audio file loaded on the drive. I cranked the volume on the surround sound system to its absolute maximum capacity. Adrian screamed her husband's name. She kicked off her heels, scrambling desperately across the hardwood floor toward the power outlet hidden behind the heavy media console. She was trying to pull the plug, trying to kill the power to the entire room before the file could load. I looked at the 2 murderers frantically, trying to stop the inevitable. I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply looked Trevor dead in the eye, raised the remote, and told the silent, captivated room that before I departed for my new medical facility, I had a very special memory of my late wife I wanted to share. I pressed play, my thumb pressed down on the center button of the smart remote. I did not just hit play. I had already maxed out the digital volume limit on Trevor's state-of-the-art surround sound system. The heavy booming speakers mounted in all 4 corners of the sprawling living room crackled to life with a sharp electrical hiss of static. Then the crisp, unmistakable voice of my late wife echoed through the foyer. Marlene sounded furious, authoritative, and brilliantly sharp. For a fleeting second, the dozens of wealthy investors and extended relatives simply looked confused. They glanced up at the ceiling, their champagne flutes hovering near their lips, as if a ghost had just hacked into the household intercom. Then the horrific context of her words registered. The 50 guests listened in absolute paralyzed silence, as Marlene laid out the exact details of the forged secondary mortgage, reading the fraudulent loan origination numbers aloud. Trevor stood completely frozen by the stone hearth. His manufactured grief vanished, replaced by the sheer hollow terror of a man watching his own execution broadcast live to his primary financial backers. He could not speak. He could not move. The audio continued mercilessly. The guests heard Adrian sobbing on the recording. They heard Marlene gasping for air, the horrifying scrape of the wooden chair, and the heavy, sickening thud of her body hitting the kitchen floor. The elite crowd, dressed in their tailored suits and cocktail dresses, physically recoiled. Some women covered their mouths in shock. The men backed away from Trevor as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. They were standing in a suburban living room, listening to a murder unfold in real time. The recording reached its darkest, most damning point. The speakers vibrated with the sound of Trevor's cold, calculated whisper. The entire room heard him explicitly instruct my daughter to step away from the phone. They heard him state that the stroke was Marlene's own fault for discovering their federal fraud. They heard him explicitly command his wife to let her mother die on the floor so they could save their failing commercial enterprise and take everything I owned. The sheer brutality of his recorded voice, stripped of all its polished, arrogant charm, hung in the air like toxic smoke. He had just confessed to intentional malicious neglect and financial elder abuse in front of the very people he desperately needed to fund his logistics business. The suffocating silence in the living room was suddenly shattered by the sharp, explosive sound of breaking crystal. One of Trevor's primary investors, a man who had been patting his shoulder in sympathy just minutes prior, dropped his glass. The flute shattered against the hardwood floor, sending shards flying across the expensive rug. No one moved to clean it up. The sound broke the trance. The wealthy crowd began murmuring, their hushed whispers rapidly escalating into panicked, disgusted exclamations. The facade of the perfect, resilient suburban family was completely annihilated. Trevor was standing completely exposed, his entire corporate and personal identity reduced to ash in front of the local elite. Adrian let out a piercing, guttural scream. The sound was not sorrowful. It was the raw, frantic screech of a cornered animal watching the walls close in. She kicked off her designer heels, ignoring the dangerous shards of broken crystal scattered across the floor. She scrambled desperately toward the heavy media console mounted beneath the television. Her crimson gown tangled around her legs as she threw herself toward the wall, clawing wildly at the thick mass of power cables hidden behind the wood. She was trying to pull the main power strip. She was trying to kill the electricity to the entire room before the audio could reveal any more details about their offshore theft. I did not let her reach the outlet. I stepped forward with the swift, calculated momentum of a man who had spent his entire life neutralizing critical system failures. As her hand lunged toward the power cord, I brought my arm down. I struck the back of her hand with a sharp, punishing slap. The loud smack of skin against skin echoed over the blaring audio system. Adrian recoiled, crying out in shock, cradling her stinging hand against her chest. She looked up at me from the floor, her eyes wide with absolute unadulterated terror. She finally realized I was not a frail, deteriorating old man waiting for a transport van. I was the architect of her destruction. Trevor snapped out of his paralyzed shock. The realization that his financial backers were actively heading for the front door triggered a violent, desperate survival instinct. He let out a furious roar and lunged directly at me. He was 35 years younger, fueled by pure adrenaline and the terrifying knowledge that he was about to lose his freedom. He abandoned all pretense of being a civilized, sophisticated businessman. He raised his fists, charging across the living room with the explicit intent to physically assault a 72-year-old man. He was absolutely desperate to tear the black flash drive out of the television port by any means necessary. He never even made it past the coffee table. The heavy mahogany double doors at the front of the foyer suddenly burst open with a deafening crash. The heavy wood slammed violently against the entryway walls, the sound mirroring the collapse of their entire empire. Trevor skidded to a halt, whipping his head around. Stepping through the threshold was Nathaniel. My lawyer did not look like a man arriving at a birthday party. He looked like an apex predator entering a feeding ground. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, and he was not alone. Flanking him on either side, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts, were 3 uniformed city police officers. The officers did not hesitate. They saw Trevor standing in an aggressive, combative stance, just inches away from me. 2 of the officers rushed forward, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. They immediately intercepted my son-in-law. They grabbed him by the shoulders, forcefully spinning him around and slamming his chest hard against the nearest structural pillar. Trevor grunted in pain, his cheek pressed flat against the drywall. He started screaming that it was a massive misunderstanding, claiming that I was a delusional psychiatric patient holding the room hostage. He desperately tried to reclaim the narrative, barking at the officers to arrest me for causing a public disturbance. Nathaniel ignored Trevor entirely. He stepped calmly into the center of the chaotic living room, his polished leather shoes crunching over the broken crystal. He surveyed the horrified guests, the sobbing daughter on the floor, and the son-in-law pinned against the wall. Nathaniel reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick official legal binder stamped with county seals. He did not raise his voice to shout over the commotion. He spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that instantly commanded the attention of every single person remaining in the house. The trap had permanently closed. The digital strike was complete, and the absolute legal slaughter was about to begin. I did not just hit play. I had already maxed out the digital volume limit on Trevor's state-of-the-art surround sound system. The heavy booming speakers mounted in all 4 corners of the sprawling living room crackled to life with a sharp electrical hiss of static. Then the crisp, unmistakable voice of my late wife echoed through the foyer. Marlene sounded furious, authoritative, and brilliantly sharp. For a fleeting second, the dozens of wealthy investors and extended relatives simply looked confused. They glanced up at the ceiling, their champagne flutes hovering near their lips, as if a ghost had just hacked into the household intercom. Then the horrific context of her words registered. The 50 guests listened in absolute paralyzed silence as Marlene laid out the exact details of the forged secondary mortgage, reading the fraudulent loan origination numbers aloud. Trevor stood completely frozen by the stone hearth. His manufactured grief vanished, replaced by the sheer, hollow terror of a man watching his own execution broadcast live to his primary financial backers. He could not speak. He could not move. The audio continued mercilessly. The guests heard Adrian sobbing on the recording. They heard Marlene gasping for air, the horrifying scrape of the wooden chair, and the heavy, sickening thud of her body hitting the kitchen floor. The elite crowd, dressed in their tailored suits and cocktail dresses, physically recoiled. Some women covered their mouths in shock. The men backed away from Trevor as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. They were standing in a suburban living room, listening to a murder unfold in real time. The recording reached its darkest, most damning point. The speakers vibrated with the sound of Trevor's cold, calculated whisper. The entire room heard him explicitly instruct my daughter to step away from the phone. They heard him state that the stroke was Marlene's own fault for discovering their federal fraud. They heard him explicitly command his wife to let her mother die on the floor so they could save their failing commercial enterprise and take everything I owned. The sheer brutality of his recorded voice, stripped of all its polished, arrogant charm, hung in the air like toxic smoke. He had just confessed to intentional malicious neglect and financial elder abuse in front of the very people he desperately needed to fund his logistics business. The suffocating silence in the living room was suddenly shattered by the sharp, explosive sound of breaking crystal. One of Trevor's primary investors, a man who had been patting his shoulder in sympathy just minutes prior, dropped his glass. The flute shattered against the hardwood floor, sending shards flying across the expensive rug. No one moved to clean it up. The sound broke the trance. The wealthy crowd began murmuring, their hushed whispers rapidly escalating into panicked, disgusted exclamations. The facade of the perfect, resilient suburban family was completely annihilated. Trevor was standing completely exposed, his entire corporate and personal identity reduced to ash in front of the local elite. Adrian let out a piercing, guttural scream. The sound was not sorrowful. It was the raw, frantic screech of a cornered animal watching the walls close in. She kicked off her designer heels, ignoring the dangerous shards of broken crystal scattered across the floor. She scrambled desperately toward the heavy media console mounted beneath the television. Her crimson gown tangled around her legs as she threw herself toward the wall, clawing wildly at the thick mass of power cables hidden behind the wood. She was trying to pull the main power strip. She was trying to kill the electricity to the entire room before the audio could reveal any more details about their offshore theft. I did not let her reach the outlet. I stepped forward with the swift, calculated momentum of a man who had spent his entire life neutralizing critical system failures. As her hand lunged toward the power cord, I brought my arm down. I struck the back of her hand with a sharp, punishing slap. The loud smack of skin against skin echoed over the blaring audio system. Adrian recoiled, crying out in shock, cradling her stinging hand against her chest. She looked up at me from the floor, her eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. She finally realized I was not a frail, deteriorating old man waiting for a transport van. I was the architect of her destruction. Trevor snapped out of his paralyzed shock. The realization that his financial backers were actively heading for the front door triggered a violent, desperate survival instinct. He let out a furious roar and lunged directly at me. He was 35 years younger, fueled by pure adrenaline and the terrifying knowledge that he was about to lose his freedom. He abandoned all pretense of being a civilized, sophisticated businessman. He raised his fists, charging across the living room, with the explicit intent to physically assault a 72-year-old man. He was absolutely desperate to tear the black flash drive out of the television port by any means necessary. He never even made it past the coffee table. The heavy mahogany double doors at the front of the foyer suddenly burst open with a deafening crash. The heavy wood slammed violently against the entryway walls, the sound mirroring the collapse of their entire empire. Trevor skidded to a halt, whipping his head around. Stepping through the threshold was Nathaniel. My lawyer did not look like a man arriving at a birthday party. He looked like an apex predator entering a feeding ground. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, and he was not alone. Flanking him on either side, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts, were 3 uniformed city police officers. Trevor's momentum was entirely focused on tearing the flash drive from the television port. He never saw the 2 uniformed officers break from Nathaniel's side. They crossed the foyer with terrifying speed, their heavy boots slamming against the hardwood. Just as Trevor raised his fist to strike me, the lead officer hit him at full velocity. The impact lifted my son-in-law entirely off his feet. He crashed violently into the heavy oak dining table, splintering the wood and sending the remaining crystal champagne glasses shattering across the floor. The officers did not give him a fraction of a second to recover. They pinned him face down against the broken glass, wrenching his arms behind his back. Trevor thrashed wildly, screaming that they were making a catastrophic mistake. He yelled that I was a deranged psychiatric patient, holding a room full of hostages, begging his investors to step in and stop the madness. Not a single investor moved a muscle. They stood paralyzed, watching the man they had trusted with millions of dollars get pressed into the floorboards. Nathaniel walked slowly into the center of the devastated living room. He did not look like a man crashing a party. He looked like an executioner stepping up to the block. He unclasped his heavy leather portfolio and let the thick stack of county-certified documents fall onto the ruined dining table, right next to Trevor's face. Nathaniel did not shout over my son-in-law's frantic screaming. He simply waited for the absolute suffocating silence of the room to return. When Trevor finally ran out of breath, Nathaniel spoke with a cold, surgical precision that commanded the attention of every person in the house. Nathaniel addressed Trevor directly, ensuring his voice carried to the wealthy backers huddled near the foyer. He announced that the commercial real estate transfer initiated 48 hours ago was entirely null and void. He explained that the seller's signature on the deed was a deliberate forensic forgery. He revealed that 2 days prior, I had legally transferred the absolute deed of the house into a protected, irrevocable offshore trust. Trevor did not own the property. He did not possess a single dime of equity. He had committed textbook wire fraud to initiate an escrow transfer for a house that belonged to a foreign corporate entity. The investors began whispering frantically to each other, realizing that the collateral Trevor had promised them was entirely fictitious. Trevor stopped struggling against the officers. The color drained from his face as he stared at the legal seals stamped across the documents, resting inches from his eyes. But Nathaniel was not finished. He turned to the second page of his portfolio. He looked down at my son-in-law and systematically dismantled the rest of his existence. Nathaniel declared that the Shadow Logistics Corporation Trevor used to hide his commercial failures was no longer beholden to an anonymous banking syndicate. Nathaniel revealed that the syndicate had been bought out entirely. He stated that I was now the sole undisputed master creditor of Trevor's entire corporate portfolio. Nathaniel informed him that due to his fraudulent activity and breach of financial covenants, the entire principal balance of $250,000 was being called in immediately. Trevor was not just bankrupt, he was financially annihilated. Adrienne finally found her voice. She pushed herself up from the floor, her crimson designer dress stained with spilled champagne and her hands trembling uncontrollably. She looked at Nathaniel, then at the police officers, and finally at me. She tried to deploy the same weapon she had used her entire life. She tried to cry. She stumbled toward me, dropping to her knees and grabbing the hem of my suit trousers. She sobbed, begging me to call off the lawyers. She claimed we were family. She pleaded that she was my only daughter, spinning a frantic, desperate lie that Trevor had manipulated her, that she never wanted her mother to die, and that she had only agreed to the psychiatric transport because she genuinely thought I was sick. I looked down at the woman who shared my DNA. I felt absolutely nothing. The paternal instinct to comfort her, to protect her from the consequences of her own actions, had died on the kitchen floor with Marlene 4 years ago. I did not bend down to help her up. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked her dead in the eye and told her that family does not forge medical documents to lock their father in a concrete ward. I told her that a daughter does not stand by and watch her mother suffocate to death to protect a failing commercial loan. I took a deliberate step backward, pulling the fabric of my trousers out of her desperate grip. I told her that she was nothing to me but a stranger who was currently trespassing in my home. The lead police officer pulled Trevor to his feet, securing the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic clicks echoed sharply through the room. A third officer stepped forward and firmly grabbed Adrian by the arm, hauling her up from the floor and securing her wrists behind her back. The lead officer read them their rights, his voice a steady mechanical drone that finalized the destruction of their empire. He formally stated the charges. They were being placed under arrest for felony wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, forgery of medical and legal documents, and extreme criminal negligence, resulting in the manslaughter of Marlene. The mention of my late wife's name was the final blow. The remaining guests did not stay to offer apologies or explanations. They filtered out of the front door in absolute horrified silence, desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic fallout. They abandoned their champagne glasses on the mantel and fled into the suburban night, leaving Trevor and Adrian completely isolated. My son-in-law did not beg. He hung his head in absolute defeat, the arrogant facade completely shattered. Adrian continued to thrash against the officer's grip, screaming my name, pleading for a second chance that she was never going to get. I did not stay to watch them get shoved into the back of the flashing patrol cars. I walked past my daughter and the man who murdered my wife without offering them a single backward glance. I moved down the hallway and entered my bedroom one last time. I reached into the closet and pulled out the small, worn canvas travel bag I had packed that morning. It contained nothing but a few changes of clothes, my passport, and the documentation for Marlene's offshore trust. I did not need anything else from this house. Every object, every piece of furniture, and every photograph in this sprawling suburban prison was tainted with their greed. I walked out the front door, stepping over the shattered glass in the foyer, and breathed in the crisp night air. It tasted like absolute freedom. I did not look at the flashing red and blue lights, illuminating the manicured lawns of the neighborhood. I walked down the driveway, climbed into my old reliable sedan, and turned the ignition. The engine hummed to life. I drove away from the suburban nightmare, navigating the quiet, empty streets with a profound sense of clarity. The heavy, suffocating weight of the last 4 years was entirely gone. I had executed the final command my wife had left me. I had dismantled the threat, neutralized the enemy, and secured our legacy. I drove across town, pulling into the flickering neon-lit parking lot of our old cafe. The bell above the door chimed as I walked inside. The diner was empty, except for Otis, who was wiping down the counter near the register. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. He did not ask what had happened. He saw the quiet, resolute stillness in my posture and understood that the war was over. I walked over to the corner booth, the exact booth where Marlene and I had spent 30 years of Sunday mornings planning our lives. I slid into the vinyl seat. Otis walked over a moment later. He did not bring a menu. He simply placed 2 heavy ceramic mugs of black coffee on the table, one directly in front of me, and one resting perfectly in front of the empty seat across the table. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, staring at the steam rising from the dark liquid. I sat in the profound, unbroken silence of the diner. It was not a lonely silence. It was the silence of a promise kept. It was the silence of absolute, unapologetic justice. Sitting in that diner, watching the steam curl into the cold air, I realized that society feeds us a very dangerous lie about family. We are taught from the moment we can understand language that blood is an unbreakable bond, an infinite well of forgiveness that requires us to absorb endless amounts of pain simply because we share a genetic code. We are conditioned to believe that a parent's love must be unconditional to the point of self-destruction. But surviving the last 4 years taught me that absolute unyielding loyalty should never be handed out by default. Loyalty must be earned through mutual respect, transparency, and a fundamental baseline of human decency. When those elements are abandoned in favor of greed, the concept of family becomes nothing more than a convenient disguise for a predator. I learned that the most profound act of self-preservation is realizing that you do not owe your abusers a polite exit. When the people you raised look at you and see nothing but an expiring asset waiting to be liquidated, you have every moral right to match their ruthlessness. My wife understood this before she died. She knew that trying to reason with terminal entitlement was a waste of breath. She did not leave me instructions to forgive them. She left me the blueprints to destroy them. It takes a terrifying amount of courage to accept that the children you nurtured have morphed into strangers you can no longer trust. But the moment you accept that truth, you strip them of their greatest weapon. Their power relies entirely on your willingness to look the other way, out of familial guilt. Do not ever let anyone convince you that protecting your own life, your own assets, and your own peace of mind is an act of betrayal. True betrayal is using the mask of a loving home to systematically dismantle someone's independence. I had to become cold, calculating, and absolutely uncompromising to survive. But doing so allowed me to reclaim my existence. The greatest lesson I can pass on is this: never underestimate the quiet ones, and never mistake a senior citizen's patience for weakness. You have the absolute right to fiercely protect whatever time you have left on this earth, and you owe nothing to those who try to steal it from you. Before I finish my coffee and figure out where my new life begins, tell me down in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe that true justice sometimes requires walking away forever.